which included crew and settlers. And on the 25th of July, the fleet ran into a hurricane, and one of the ships eventually ran aground on the rocks just off the shores of an uninhabited island, and the passengers and crew and a dog were able to make it to the shores of what we now know as Bermuda. And the crew and passengers set to work building a settlement there, including a church and some houses, and this original settlement is thought to constitute the founding of Bermuda. So I want to talk about place-related rights. So we now think that a royal charter accompanied by colonization with an aim to effect control, this assumption that it would legitimately claim land for the English crown is now thought to be deeply antiquated, rooted in an imperial mentality that ignored the claims and agency of indigenous people. So the question that I'm wondering about is what exactly is the appropriate relationship between people and territory? If we no longer accept the basic assumptions of the London Company, what theory of territory do we now hold consonant with democratic and liberal values? And what do we think of claims in places like Bermuda, which at the time that Sir George Somers landed was completely uninhabited? Is land that is uninhabited simply up for grabs? Can people settle on that land and claim rights to it? And if we think that the land can be occupied legitimately, what rights follow from this claim? More specifically, even if we think that these people had a right to settle on uninhabited land, that their occupation of Bermuda was not illegitimate, and so they were permitted to land there and settle there, does this give them an entitlement to exclude other people from landing and settling there? And if it does, what gives them the right to exclude? And how far does it extend? Those are the questions about the paper. And that's my central example because it's an easy example, and then I'll complicate it. So the strategy of the paper is to consider control over territory and rights to control borders together. And so a lot of work on the ethics of migration focuses on the policies and practices of states that are normatively defensible. And my question is what I think is a more fundamental question, which is the justificatory arguments underlying rights over territory and the implication of this for the issue of control over border. So I'm going to talk about place-related rights first. So first I look at so the example leads me to think about the basic right to live in a place, free from the threat of expulsion. And sometimes this is presented as a very weak right, a right to occupy somewhere, but I argue for a stronger version of a moral occupancy right, that is the right to occupy the place you are currently in if you come to live there unjustly. There are different ways in which we could interpret the not unjustly qualification, because we would need to figure out what that was, but in the spirit of Sir George Somers and his settlers, we could say they had a permissive right to occupy the island because doing so did not entail doing anything unjust or wrong. So what I want to say in that case is that they were at liberty to land there and settle there. The land had been unoccupied for several centuries, so I have legitimate occupancy as a default principle. That is, an occupancy is legitimate if it's not illegitimate, and it's illegitimate if a group has to be expelled or dispossessed in order to occupy it. So let me move on to further complications. So I want to extend the idea of legitimate occupancy from simply a liberty right to occupy a place that is unoccupied to claim it involves a right of non-dispossession. So I argue that having settled there and having started to build houses and churches and till the soil and develop projects and relationships on that land, it would be wrong to expel them. It would be wrong to dispossess them from the location of their project and relationships, even apart from the unjust process by which people are typically removed from their homes and community. So why might we think that they have a moral right not to be dispossessed? The principal idea, I think, is that we are physical beings, we occupy space, and within that space we develop projects and relationships and pursue a general way of life to which we are typically attached. And some of the attachments are to the place, and some are to the projects and to the people that share the space with us, to families and friends and community which form the background context in which we live our lives. So this means that in addition to the unjust coercion that typically accompanies expulsion, there is a fundamental injustice in disrupting the background conditions in which we live our lives, pursue our projects and relationships, and exercise choices. So I give sort of two reasons why the particular place is important. Some is, first, that people form attachments and relations with others in particular places, and expulsion from the place is disruptive to that, but also people make have developed aims and activities on the assumption that they live in that place, and sometimes that place is integral to their choices and their projects. So it's not just the people, it's also the place. Because if it was just the people, you could expel the whole people and it would somehow be less unjust than if you just, if you expelled everybody, which seems, so what I want to say is that sometimes there's attachments to the particular place itself. So there's a lot of questions begged, important questions begged in the really simple enunciation of that moral right of occupancy. And these questions are begged even in a very straightforward case like the settlement of an uninhabited Caribbean island. And the first question is, what counts as unoccupied? And in some respects, the fact that it was an island simplifies matters enormously because we often think of islands as geographically bounded because they're bounded on all sides by water. So if the whole island's unoccupied, it's a clear case. But suppose that Sir George Somers landed on the island in 1609, which he did, and the following year, a second group from Spain landed on the other side of the island. Would they be entitled to settle on the land? So if we accept the idea of non-dispossession, we can say, well, it's obviously wrong if they dispossess them, but what if they settle on the other side of the island? What counts as unoccupied? Because we don't expect people to live side by side and to occupy the whole place physically, right? So one question I don't consider, although I do have an answer elsewhere to that question, is the scope of the occupancy principle, except to say, so the question I'm asking isn't the question about if a group settles on a land and they're occupying it, how far does that occupancy extend? Although I want to say that you'd have to do a context, sort of an analysis of their use of the land and their projects and relationships. So my question is another question. I just want to separate that as a question, which is that does this moral right of occupancy include a right to exclude people as individuals from settling on land that we accept is already occupied? So there's a question about what we think of as occupied, but if we say that this particular piece is occupied, what do we think about them excluding other people, right? So to return to the example, what if the occupants of the Spanish ship, some Spanish ship that arrives a year later, do not seek to settle as a community on the exact location of the English and expel them or anything? It's not a colonization project, but they seek to be admitted as individuals to the community that the English settlers, led by Sir George Somers, have already created. Do they have rights of access? Do the English settlers, embodied by Sir George Somers and his people, do they have a right to exclude them from their settlement project, and what would justify that exclusion? Okay, so now I get to I try to build on that account. So at this point in the paper, I discuss different accounts of territory. I discuss Lockean, Hobbesian, and Kantian accounts, kind of briefly, to what answers they give to this question. I'm going to skip over that, and except to say that all those accounts have the feature of describing the relationship between the people and the state first, and then imagining that rights to particular territories, the different kinds of rights associated with territory, will then fall into place. But the strategy that I'm trying to pursue, that I'm adopting, proceeds somewhat differently. I try to solve the problem of relating authority over people and authority over land together through an analysis of the relationship between the group and the land and the people in the group. So to return to Sir George Somers and the occupants of the ship that ran aground in Bermuda, so I've already discussed that they have a moral right of occupancy, and now I want to discuss the relationship between the people and the land, which is involved there, and also between the people. So I think a discussion of jurisdictional, so it gives us an account, I need an account of jurisdictional rights, and I'm going to talk about the relationship between the people on the land. So suppose after they find themselves stranded on the island, they reconcile themselves to that situation. They work to build houses, and they have a common public space, and they try to build a life there. So they're involved not only in securing goods for their survival, but they're involved in a relationship with one another. And we can imagine that that relationship that they have is valuable. And it's valuable because it involves both what I call relationship-independent goods and relationship-dependent goods. So relationship-independent goods are goods that satisfy an interest that a person has, which require some kind of relationship to meet it, but it doesn't require that that relationship is with a particular person or a particular set of persons. So children have a relationship-independent interest in being cared for and clothed and educated. They're not interests they can meet on their own. So whether these interests are met depends often on the child's relationship with significant others, usually parents in their lives. So a child has an interest in food, shelter, and clothing, can't meet it itself, there's a relationship-dependent interest. But described in those terms, it doesn't depend. Anybody can meet those interests as those they are described. They could be met not by the parent, but by another party. The child might be cared for by someone else. And that's how often we think about a group's interest in being governed by a rule-governed procedure or an institution in which human rights are respected and people are treated impartially. This depends on the person being related appropriately to the political and legal organization and institutions. And so a lot of justifications of the political order are of this kind, pointing to the various interests that are served by the creation of a rule-governed political order. But some moral values embedded in relationships reflect our relationship-dependent interests. And these are goods which are distinctive to the relationship itself. So while children can be fed and housed and clothed by anyone, sometimes it's important who is in the relationship in which these goods are realized, and some goods cannot be realized except with certain particular persons. Think of relationships that realize certain intrinsic goods or benefits. So you can think of love or intimacy or mutual affection, or concern, sometimes the sheer joy of sometimes spending time together. So in many of our relationships, like intimate relationships or close friendships, the goods can only be realized by a particular other and cannot be met satisfactorily by assigning a substitute. So the good of intimacy cannot be met by asking someone to be physically intimate with my lover. It has to be met, I hope, by me. And visiting my mother in hospital, it matters to her that it's me. So we don't, and here I'm not imagining that these value of the relationships rests on autonomy. In the case of Sir George Somers, the location of the settlement was unchosen, and often the experience was unchosen too because the crew ended up being settlers too. But nevertheless, I want to say they were in a valuable relationship which involved enduring, not episodic interactions that were substantive in content and mutual in the sense that they were oriented to other participants in the relationship. So over time, I'm imagining, the people did not seek to be rescued from Bermuda and transported to Virginia where they were intended to go. They loved the sun and the water. They knew all the features of their island home. They had built a life there that involved enduring interactions, and then they sought to be engaged in a political project with other members of the settlement. So I'm imagining that they developed a subjective identity as participants in a project that didn't involve simply settling land, but governing themselves according to rules and procedures that they work out themselves. And I have an argument here that is not a freedom of association argument, and also I have an argument that tries to cash out the idea that they constitute a collective agent, insofar as the members of the group shared a collective identity, and their actions and goals can only be understood in relationship with one another, right? That they couldn't be reducible to the individual, to individuals within the relationship. So in this political relationship, in this endeavor, they participate and benefit from relationship goods, and the main good is that of creating a common life together, producing or maintaining institutions and practices that help to shape the collective circumstances of their lives. So if that's the picture that's in place, now let me answer the question. If that's the picture that's in place, where we're imagining that the members co-create and co-maintain the practices and institutions of their common life, we can see why they might want to control borders. So jurisdictional authority is not simply a kind of idea, a right to defend justice as a universal ideal, but depends on an argument that locates moral value in each particular state or in each particular collective self-determination project. So I want to describe the right to jurisdictional authority as the right of a political community to make decisions about the collective conditions of its existence and the mechanism by which members of the political community implement and maintain their own conception of how they want to organize their society. Now at this point, what I'm trying to do here, just to be straightforward, is that in the discussions about territorial rights of states, so John Simmons has this very nice discussion where you have jurisdictional authority as one of the rights, and then there's these other territorial rights that follow from it, and one is this right against aliens. But I want to describe the right against, so he puts it in a separate category and says it has to be justified as a right against aliens. But I want to say that rules about entry and exit can be straightforwardly understood as an extension of jurisdictional authority. And this is often obscured from view because people tend to think of jurisdictional authority as involving the state and its citizens, and immigration rules typically applying to people seeking entry, non-members. But I wonder about this because why don't we think of rules about entry and exit as just one sort of rule that co-members of a political community make to govern their relations within a territory. So to see this, imagine that a potential immigrant, somebody comes, manages to get to a territory, and then the jurisdictional authority says, well, you can only stay or remain on the territory if you have a visa of a certain type. So under one description of this, it says, John Simmons says it's a right against aliens. But why isn't that also not something distinct from the exercise of jurisdictional authority, but flowing from it? So it's true that the rules often apply before the immigrant gets here, but if we can imagine that the immigrant comes and now you apply the rule, then isn't it just a kind of an efficiency argument that you just require the visa before they've actually arrived so you don't have to then deport them, right? So I'm just wondering why we don't see, why rules about what kind of visa you might need isn't seen as a direct application of jurisdictional authority. Okay, so that's the first question or move I make that I probably can raise questions about. So then I say that there are good reasons why, and we can see why there are good reasons why a collectively self-determining group, which has significant forms of control over the conditions of their existence, would seek to have control over who and how many enter their community. And there's both relationship-independent and relationship-dependent reasons connected to their self-determination project, which impacts on this question. So let's consider first relationship-independent reasons. So control over many aspects of one's collective life, from education policies, healthcare policies, and services, are impacted by issues connected to demographic balance between rural and urban communities, for example, the rate and flow of migrants, the kind of migrants one accepts. So at some level then, it would be difficult for political communities to make collective choices over many aspects of their existence without some control over this vital component of many different policies. It's hard to think how a political community could exercise significant control over the collective conditions of their existence if they entirely lacked this kind of control. If the people were to lack entirely the capacity to make decisions over entry and exit at any level, then we would question the kind of collective control or self-determination that they can exercise over their collective life. Like the Uyghurs or the Tibetans in China, there might be some capacity to make local decisions, but to the extent that they lack this power, they also lack the ability to have robust forms of self-determination. And those examples are not, these are communities where the Han Chinese have migrated extensively. If you would ask the people living there whether they like this, they would say no. And it's one of the reasons why it's very hard for them to exercise any form of self-determination over their project, okay? But there are also relationship-dependent reasons, and this is connected to like just the kinds of policies you would want to pursue. There are also relationship-dependent reasons which suggest a right to exclude. So in many cases, it's an important part of the relationship that it is with particular people, with the people who are identified by themselves and by others as members of a certain collective or community. This is true of indigenous people, for example, who seek to be collectively self-governing as indigenous people, or of particular nations institutionalized in states who aspire to and often have various forms of sub-state autonomy. So they have a shared identity, a shared we as people who seek to be collectively self-determining over their conditions of their existence, and it would be undermined if they could not set the terms of this relationship. So reasons of the first kind, so I'm just going to reflect on these two different kinds of relationship reasons. So reasons of the first kind are connected to legitimate democratic policy goals. So it's hard, if you don't have control over your border, to exercise control over many different legitimate public policy goals. So they point to the need for a self-determining political entity to exercise some control over borders as an aspect of control, collective control of other dimensions of collective life in general. So I think that's a less controversial claim. But reasons of the second kind about who can be included in the relationship bear on the claim that self-determination includes a right to determine what the self is, by which I mean the composition of the polity. How am I doing? Okay, so this is suggested by the analogy with other relationships such as friendship, where it's crucial to the relationship that there's mutuality, and that some people might want to be my friend, and I can imagine there could be someone who wants to be my friend who I don't want to be friends with, and I don't think there's a need to justify the reasons why I don't think somebody could be my friend. So is this the right model to think about political relationships, or is this the right model to think about immigration? And at this point I address whether a concern that I have, whether this analysis of the relationship could justify very illiberal, indeed racist immigration policies, such as the White Australia policy. So I want to say there's both kinds of reasons, but then when I get to the relationship dependent reasons, I've raised this concern. And just to be really quick here, I argue that it's not an implication of my argument, and I do this really on 3 grounds, which is essentially, I mean, just because I think people have rights to collective self-determination over their existence, which includes some right to exclude, doesn't mean that I get rid of justice or principles of democracy. So, and precisely because I've argued that it's an extension of jurisdictional authority, right? The control over borders can be seen as an extension of jurisdictional authority. You would want rules to be applied generally, right? You would want rules to not favor people on. I mean, we don't think that a just polity would have rules favoring certain races over other races. That would be a violation of justice and of the equality principle inherent in democracy. So I think that all government policies should be governed by procedures which are fair and non-discriminatory. So I put it as, you have publicly funded educational institutions can admit some people and exclude others, but it would still have a requirement that the process is fair and the criteria is publicly justifiable and transparent. So that's how I try to deal with that concern, which I think is a concern. So that's how I try to deal. So now what I've got in place here is the idea that there's relationship independent and relationship dependent reasons why you would want to have some control over borders, right? So, but even if that account of territory, even if you accept that it offers a coherent account of the moral value of territory and its relationship to self-determination, and even if you accept my view in which control over borders is an extension of the political community's jurisdictional authority, that would still be a problem if immigration controls were thought in their essence to violate basic human rights or constitute a serious injustice. And I think there's 2 kinds of arguments that are made in the literature, which I just re-describe and then think about. And the first argument is that it violates the right to free movement, and the second argument is that it violates people's, there's distributive justice and objections to it, right? So I'll just I have a long discussion about the freedom of movement, which I talk about Joe Cairns, but the essential move here, I have 2 moves. One is to have first a sufficientarian account of what freedom of movement is, but then also to distinguish between free movement and settlement. Because one of the real difficulties I have with this free movement literature is that it talks about freedom of movement, and movement implies a very intrusive regulation in physical movement. And I think some types of migration controls do place burdensome and unreasonable restrictions on autonomous movements for purposes that do not entail long-term settlement. But the type of movement that really is at issue in arguments about control over borders is the movement associated with labor and resettlement. Although, of course, there are also some restrictions, I think reasonable restrictions on people likely to commit crimes or something. So there's some restrictions on free movement, but what people are really talking about is settlement, right? And I think that whole freedom of movement discussion should be recast. That's, in a way, how I move here. So it's easy to agree that movement is a basic human right and that there should be a high burden of justification for constraining a person's ability to travel, to go to a certain place at a certain time, and even more generally, his or her decision to live in a particular relationship within a particular broad community, which is why restrictions on movement within the same country are so unconscionable. And so if there's an island really close to Bermuda, for example, in which some other community settled, say the Spanish ship eventually landed on it, and we might think that to realize the good of freedom of movement, people on one island should be able to visit the other, go on hikes, move around on the other island. But settlement, I think, is quite different, for it is directly and obviously related to self-determination in a way that human movement is not. And the most obvious, I think, contemporary example of this is Palestine, where clearly the settlement of Jewish families might increase the social welfare and autonomy of those specific families, but it clearly interferes with the other self-determination. And on the other hand, refusing the right of Jews or Christians for religious pilgrimage at Jerusalem, for example, if there was an intrusive Palestinian jurisdiction over those sites, would be an unreasonable restriction on autonomous movement. So what I want to say here is that while all restrictions on liberty require justification, in the sense that there are good policy reasons to justify it, not all restrictions count as a violation of the basic human right to free movement. And I think that settlement bears particularly on collective self-determination, in which mere movement doesn't. And then you have to consider that sometimes individuals' right to free movement might have effects on the idea of people being able to create political communities which are valuable to them. And then I discussed Karen's waiting metaphor. I'm going to talk about that. So that gets me to distributive injustice. And I think that's a more pressing cosmopolitan criticism of border controls from a justice direction, because we can think of border controls as exacerbating inequalities and so inimical to global justice and the violation of people's basic rights to subsistence or to live a decent life. And I think this criticism has some teeth. And so the idea here is that many people in the world live inadequate lives, they're impoverished, undernourished, and with few opportunities. So we don't need to suppose that the affluent world caused their poverty and lack of opportunity. But nevertheless, these people might still complain that a world divided between territorially organized political units which prevent people from crossing borders and improving their situation is morally illegitimate. It exacerbates inequality or deprivation because it prevents them from taking courses of action which could remedy this situation. So this is a criticism, really, of the territorial ordering of the world into political communities with discretionary power over entry. So the claim here cannot simply be that the consequences of acting on territorial rights are bad, that self-determination over territory exacerbates inequality, because if political communities have a right to make decisions about their collective life and to exercise jurisdictional authority, and part of this entitlement is control over borders, then the exercise of this, then they still have this right regardless whether the exercise of the right results in suboptimal consequences. Rather, the claim here has to be that the exercise of territorial right violates the moral rights of people. So a stronger version would say that people have a right to a decent life, included amongst this are subsistence rights. I think this is true. And that while territorial rights or immigration policies do not need to optimize welfare or equalize welfare or promote equality, it's a source of serious moral concern if they jeopardize people's basic rights. And so I think that's the way the structure of the argument has to be. It doesn't have to produce equality, but it's a serious moral concern if they jeopardize people's basic rights. And so not having done much work, I follow Henry Shue in arguing that people have basic or fundamental rights to life, liberty, security, and subsistence. And so in addition to liberty and security, there's a basic right to subsistence. And I just follow him in the argument for why that is. So that suggests that, on my argument, that we should have collective self-determination and collective self-determination over immigration if it's consistent with the basic rights of everyone. So what does that mean? So I actually say three things. So I have 1 minute. Okay, so I say three things. One of which is that the basic right to the exercise of collective self-determination isn't inimical to basic subsistence rights in one way, because jurisdictional authority establishes rules of justice which regulate people's lives and make it possible for them to live lives that are better. Then I say, well, this account also helps to justify the obligations that we have to refugees, because if people's lives and liberties are threatened, it's clear they are entitled to safe haven. So, and I'll have a discussion of what that involves. I go back to Sir George Summers and people straggling up the island. And then the third is, it suggests that states have further obligations to outsiders to ensure that their basic subsistence rights are met. And there's some debate on what this involves. But what I want to end up here with this idea, but the problem is that if they have a right to a basic right to subsistence, which I accept, then having immigration policies that assist people is one way in which we could facilitate that right. But it's not the only way, right? I mean, you could have a fairer ordering of the trade rules in the world, or you could have substantial redistribution. So the basic right to subsistence suggests a number of policy alternatives, because what I want to argue is, so I don't think there's I think that like market capitalist economies can easily absorb, have much stronger permissive, much more permissive immigration policies in a way that could be designed to meet these needs. But I can imagine, or actually have in my mind, that some kinds of collective self-determination projects, and I'm thinking of the Uyghurs and the Tibetans that I talk about, who want to limit the possible influx of Han Chinese, who might alter the character of their project or their ability to establish their own rules to govern their lives, or agrarian or nomadic communities. So what I want to say is that I don't see that you could dispense this obligation, right? You could meet that obligation in other ways than having a permissive immigration policy by these other mechanisms. So that's how I end. Okay?